All right, let's do another video here. We're going to be taking a look today at adding some particles into an Unreal Engine scene. We're going to be doing a very brief look at particles here in just creating something that kind of will add a little bit of a flair to a scene. We're doing dust particles. So we're going to creating those little particulates of stuff that you see in the air, that usually catches the sunlight. It gives you that little kind of a glint when it kind of catches the light the right way. So to do that, I'm going to first, I've got an Unreal project here open. I'm going to go first into a new folder that I'll just call particles here. Just keep all of the content we're creating today separate. I'm not going to be creating that much content. The first thing I'm going to create is I'm going to create a material. Now we need to put a material on our particles. If we don't do this, they're going to have the default particle system, which you'll see when I create the particle system. It's just this little crosshair, but it's not going to be useful at all. So I'm going to call this master material particle, and I'll go into this material. And there's a couple of things that we're going to want. So these little particulates of dust are usually just tiny little circles, and so I'm going to go and create that with a radial gradient exponent. And we're not going to end up using this in the long run, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this up, and as our needs change as we create this particle system, so too will the material. So the output of a radial gradient, we go and take a look at this here on a plane, is going to do exactly what it says. It's going to create a gradient in the shape of a circle. So this is going to work really, really well for our particle system. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to create what is called a particle color. And particle color is the node that allows us to interface with the color over life module inside of the particle editor. So these two things are going to allow us to change the color of the particle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a couple of multiplies here, and we're going to multiply this radial gradient against both the RGB color. This is how we're going to get the color of our particle, and against the alpha, which is how we're going to get the transparency for our particle. And I'm going to go and place that into the opacity. Now the opacity is grayed out. That's because by default, materials do not contain opacity. It's rather expensive. So I'm going to go and switch this from an opaque material to a translucent one. That'll open up that opacity for us. And now we have this little tiny dot here. Now I'm also displaying this on a plane. And that's kind of important as well when you're building material for particles, because each of the particles are going to be little planes or triangles that face the camera. So it's kind of important that we get that done correctly. So for now, let's go and use this this particle system here just like this, or the material just like this. And I'm going to right click, and now we can go and create a particle system. I'm going to call this PS Dust for particle system dust. And I'm going to open this up, and here is the old particle emitter editor. So this is what's known as Cascade. And it's important to note that this has been replaced with Niagara. Especially when you move into UE5, this system no longer exists. I'm going to continue to use this system only because I have not yet learned Niagara, and it wouldn't be useful for me to teach that just yet. So I'm going to use the old system here, which still works and does exactly what it's supposed to. But it's using Unreal's old interface, so that's why it looks kind of rather different than what you're used to. Also here, as I mentioned, are those little crosshair textures that we're seeing in our emitter. So our particle system contains a single emitter called particle emitter. This is where we're going to create the dust. And inside this emitter, there are several modules that have already been created, giving it a default appearance of this kind of shooting these things up into the air. I'm going to go and bring this into the world here, and I'll move it up a little bit, and we can see that we get one-to-one the system in the world and in our editor, which is kind of nice. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is grab my material, and I'm going to go to the required module, and it's the first required entity here. So when I go and put that in, we should see in the world that we're now getting, instead of the little crosshairs, we're getting little puffs of white as they go and drift up. So lovely. The idea is that I'm going to go and manipulate the modules that are here. And as I require more modules, I will go and create them. So there's that one. I'm going to go into the lifetime. And under lifetime here, we have a distribution of a maximum of 1 second and a minimum of 1 second, which means all the particles are lasting a second in length. Now, the reason they appear to be disappearing at different times here actually has to do with their velocity. Some of them moving faster than the others, and that way they're able to get a little bit further in 1 second before they die. I'm going to go and manipulate this. I'm going to make them last at least 3 seconds, and let's do a maximum of, let's say, 8. Now they're going to kind of drift and stay on screen here quite a bit longer. You get what looks a little bit more like a geyser now coming out of this thing. The next node is the initial size, and here they've got a maximum and minimum across X, Y, and Z of 25. I'm going to go and change this to a vector constant so that there's only one size of particle. I don't really care about variation much. And I'm going to bring this down to 1. So what we should have now, pardon me, though not as easy to see, is little tiny dots being emitted up. If we go look at this in the world here, they'll be outlined for us to see them a little bit easier. So that's kind of cool. You know, see these little guys trailing up and doing what they're supposed to do. Now, we don't want them all to be moving in this direction here. Our next node is called initial velocity. This is going to control the directionality in which they are moving. So if we go and look at the start velocity here and we open this up, we can see that they are moving in X, 10 and negative 10. So that's going to move them left, which is negative 10, and right, 10. So that's why they're kind of spreading apart. The same is true for Y. That's what's giving us this kind of conical effect here. I've gone and lost them all completely. Usually the F button is enough to frame them so you can see them. Let's turn on our bounds. There they are. So by turning on the bounds, I'm going to make it so that I can see them again here, at least where they live. There they are there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the initial velocity, and instead of having them, and you can see here why they're drifting up, we have 100 in Z and 50 as the minimum. So no matter what, they're going to be moving up. Oh, I just actually want them to drift in all directions. So I'm going to add 10 and negative 10 to the system here as well. And we'll go and save that. And what you're going to see happen here is that the particles are being emitted from that initial location, and they're all drifting outwards 10 units at a maximum of 10 units a second. So this is a fairly small little system here. If I want this to occupy more space, we're going to have to manipulate it again further. So let's go and move this over to the corner here and go and place it somewhere a little bit more useful, like in the corner here. So we'll try and make it occupy a little bit more space here. Okay, I don't want them all to be coming from that origin point. That's not how dust works. They kind of just drift in and out as they move. So let's go and do that. I'm going to go into my emitter here, and I'm going to right click in the module section, and I'm going to add a new module. This is going to be called location, initial location. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to give me the ability to choose the origin point from which they are going to spawn. So here we have 0 in X, 0 in Y, and 0 in Z. So they're all coming from the origin or right in the middle of this point. I'm going to give it the option, let's make this 5 meters. So let's make it 10 meters. Let's go 500 centimeters in X and negative 500 in X. And then we'll just copy those same numbers all the way across. Like so. So what that's going to do, you'll see, is that the particles are actually now pretty widespread. Let's get it out of the corner here just a little bit. And I'm going to move it up a little bit too to make sure they're not going through the floor. But you can see now that we're kind of getting, at least in this little region of the corner here, every now and then kind of one of these little particles is going to drift by. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is go to our color over life. So this one is a little bit hard to see, but what's going on here is that the particles are being born white and then they constantly fade out until they just disappear. Not what I want at all. In fact, we can go visualize this by looking at the alpha over life. So here we have a curve on which there are 2 points. Point 1 finds itself at time 0 with a value of 1. So when the particles are born at time 0, they have a transparency value or an opacity value of 1, meaning fully opaque. The next point on the curve is at 1 in the timeline, which is when they die. The out value here is 0. This means that the particles are being born. We'll draw this on a graph so that you can see it. The particles are being born and then slowly just fading out. So if I bring in my tool here and we were to try and graft this in the scene here, so here is our graph, okay? And what we've got is time down here and opacity down here, or going up this way. What's happening is that they're being born up here fully opaque, and then they just drop off until they die completely invisible. That's not what we want to have happen. Actually, what we want to have happen is have them born invisible and fade in, have them live for a little bit, and then drop back down to hit 0 when they die. So instead of this constant line going down, we want a curve that's going to go up, stay straight, and then drop back down. This means that we're going to need a point here and here, a point here and here. So at point 0, time 0, the opacity is going to be 0. Here we can say at, let's say, point 2 in time, we're going to want an opacity of 1. So that's going to give us our fade in. Here, which we can say is maybe 0.8, we're going to have an opacity of 1 as well. So this is going to be a fairly straight line in between here, depending on how we adjust our curve. And then when they die, which is a time of 1, they're going to have an opacity back at 0. So this is going to give us this curve in the way that we want it. Now, Unreal has the ability to show us these curves. We can do this by going and turning on the little graph here in beside these guys. So if I go to Cover Over Life and I turn this little graph icon on, we can see absolutely. Let's hide the Color Over Life because it's not as important. And here is that line, right? Starting at white, drifting all the way down to black. So as we mentioned, we want 4 points. I'm going to go and delete the 2 that are here. And in Alpha Over Life, I'm going to click the plus 4 times. Point 1 is going to be 0 in 0, so it's already correct. Point 2 was going to be a timeline of point 2, and an out value of 1, meaning it's going to go up to that point. We now want it to sit at 1 until it hits point 8. So, in the third point on our graph, I'm going to go and set 0.8 as the time and 1 as the value. So you can see there, and we need one more point down here. This is going to be in 0.3, 1, and 0. And now we can see that they're going to fade in, stay completely visible, and then fade out before they die. So good, that's going to give us a little bit of a better result. Now again, it's really hard to see that result. These things are really, really small. In fact, they might be a little overly small. If I go and get rid of the grid marker here, or the hop into game mode so we don't see the outline anymore, we can see that they do kind of fade in. They drift around a little bit. Some over there, some over there. It's not too bad. I might even go into the color here. Let's go into Color Over Life, and I'm going to make them a little bit more amber colored. Try and mimic what would happen if they were picking up the color of the sun. So instead of a curve here, I'm going to do a constant because I don't need their color to change, and I just want to pull up a little bit of that amber sunlight color so that they kind of appear the right way. Okay, let's go see what we can do about adding a few more of these as well. So I'm going to go into the spawn rate, and we have 20. I'm just going to double this to 40. Now, You do have to be careful with particles, right? Each one of them is drawing. Each one of them is going to add to the draw time of your scene. So having too many of them spread over too large of an area is not going to be very performance, very nice to performance. Okay, so that's not bad. I think for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to take their initial location and I'm going to drop it down half just so that we can keep them a little bit more on screen here. So I'm going to go from 500 to 250. So instead of a 10-meter range that they find themselves in, they are instead going to find themselves in just a 5-meter range. This means they're going to be a little bit more contained to the middle here. Okay. The next thing that I'm noticing with these particles is that they are drifting in completely straight lines. So when you see one appear and it's moving, and it stays moving in that direction until it disappears, which is not what I want. I kind of want them to feel a little bit more chaotic, right? I want to make them feel like they're little tiny mini changes in the atmosphere or in the wind here that is, picking them up and drifting them in different directions. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to start manipulating the rotation of these objects. Now, if I go and add a initial rotation, and we go and set that initial rotation range to be -1 and 1, that's going to have 0 output on what we're looking at. And the reason it's going to have 0 output has to do with our material. So if we look at our material here, and we look at the preview of our material, again, place it on a plane. When this spins, its pivot point is right in the middle, and it's just going to spin arbitrarily around that pivot point. So rotating it isn't really going to do anything. However, if we made some changes here to our radial gradient, we can make this rotation make a little bit more sense. So for instance, if we were to go to our radius, I'm going to add a scalar parameter to the radius. And we can go and change that parameter value to 0.1. So that means that the dot is now being drawn 1/10 of its size. Right away, I'm going to go and increase the size of my particles by 10 to offset this change. That way the particles won't actually change in size. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to offset this in its wireframe. So if I go here to the brush wireframe, although it is hard to see, that particle is still in the middle of the wireframe. And what I want to do is I want to move it. So let me draw this again here in case it's a little bit unclear. Here is our plane upon which we have placed our circle. And currently our circle is right here. We've changed its scale, so it's dropped down. But we still have the same problem in that it's going to rotate about itself. So what I plan to do is to move the circle up to the corner. That way, when it rotates, the circle will actually pivot around the plane, like so. This will give us a little bit of motion inside of the texture without really having to do too much. So I'm going to go back to my lit mode here to view this thing. And we're going to go here. Let's go and we have our radius. We're going to change our center position as well. Okay, so this is it right here. For this, I'm going to create a 2 vector. We'll place this in here. And we're going to go set this to, let's try 0.5 and 0.5. That's not good. 0.1, 0.1, 0.5, 0.5 puts it right in the middle. There it is. So 0.1, I've got it up and to the left now. This is becoming a little bit harder to see, but let's go back into our wireframe. And it is indeed finding itself right there in that first box. Okay, so if I save this now and we look at our particles here as they're born, they're still not twisting, right? They're still not moving. They're still in perfectly straight lines. And that's because the rotation node that I added, this initial rotation, is when they spawn. What rotation do they have? We actually need to tell them to rotate while they're moving. So if we go to rotate and we say rotate rate, initial rotation rate, and let's go give this a plus or minus of Let's do minus 0.2 and 0.2. Okay, so if we click that, now when we watch the particles, they're actually not going to be moving in straight lines, but they're going to be going along that orbit. This means that we should start getting, and it looks like 0.2 is really, really too small. Let's try 1 and 1. We'll save that. You can see 1 and 1 is overkill. We now actually see that spiraling going out of control. So let's cut it down in half. We don't want them to move unnaturally. We just want them to look like little gusts of wind are picking them up and moving them. Okay. Okay, I could live with that. Some of them are moving rather quickly. Again, we can go and reduce this even further. Let's cut it in half again. So from 0.5 to 0.25. And that's, I think, probably the most natural version of this that we're going to get. Now, I have introduced, in the way that I've built this, I've introduced a very major problem. That major problem is called overdraw. And overdraw happens when you are drawing too much transparency through transparency. So if I were to go into our optimization view modes here and we go to quad overdraw, we actually get this graph where we can see how bad the overdraw is. We want to be in either the darkest blue shading color here or the lightest blue if we can handle it. Probably even black would be better. But you can see what happens as soon as one of the particles is up close, you start rendering other particles through it, right? We're now getting transparency through transparency through transparency through transparency. When we get up to 4, we can actually get it all the way up to 7 here when we start getting some really, really, really heavily grouped overlap. You can see it kind of fluctuating over here on this one. So there is a trick that we can do to help alleviate this problem. For that trick to work, we're going to have to disband or remove our radial gradient. Now, this is not all that expensive what we're doing here, but this is expensive. So let me go into Photoshop and create a new texture that we can use to replace this. So this is going to be a really tiny texture. I'm just going to make it 256 by 256. I'm going to fill it with black. And I'm just going to go and create a little dot using my brush in the top left like that. Okay. We could even go in and blur it a little bit, but I'm going to save it just like that. I'm going to go and throw this on my desktop called Dust. And just like that, we now have what we're going to use. Back inside of Unreal, I'm going to import that particle texture that we've just created. And I'm going to bring it into our material. And I didn't put anything in the alpha map here. We're just using the RGB values. So what I'm going to do is we're going to remove this and remove this. In fact, I'm just going to use the straight particle color for the color. That's because there's no information inside of this thing. And I'll use its red channel for the alpha. The end result here is identical. The end result is that, well, we're still going to see that overlap, right? We're still going to see it drawing the same way. We are still going to see in the lit mode that they drift and have that rotational orbit as they go, so that we're getting some curvature in some of the way that these particles are moving. So if it didn't fix anything, why did we do it? Well, that's because we haven't actually told it to fix anything yet. I'm going to do this while looking at the optimization mode quad draw so that we can see the effect here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to head into my required module node, and I'm going to scroll down until what we get here is a particle cutout option. Now, what this is used for is using a black and white image to, instead of using a full plane, cut our particle out of that plane using geometry. Geometry is always going to be more cheap to render than is opacity. So this is going to give us a much better use here. So I'm going to put this in here. You're going to notice again, nothing has changed. And that's because it's trying to look at where to use the image here. I didn't put anything in the alpha channel. So we're going to go into the red channel and watch what happens as soon as I turn this on. The overdraw is gone. Now it's using the same image that we're using for our texture to cut the particles out from the plane. And so now they actually have no overdraw. The only time they're ever going to have any overdraw is when one particle happens to go directly over another, instead of the full plane upon which they find themselves. This is now cheap. We're now finding ourselves only in 1 and 2 here, without very little of anything else appearing. If we go back to our lit mode, we should see that this also should look identical the way that it did a moment ago, because we haven't really changed anything. The one other thing that I'm going to change is also going to be inside of the material here, and I'm going to add what is called a depth fade. Now, what a depth fade is going to do is it's going to take our current opacity as an opacity in, and it's going to give us a fade distance value. The default value here is 100, which I think is going to work quite nicely. And the entire purpose of this is going to be so that when your particle system, or when your particles themselves, get too close to a surface like this, instead of actually just going through the surface, they're going to disappear. They're going to alpha out once they get close enough to it. So as a particle drifts near the wall here, you'll actually see it just turn invisible. So that's going to prevent any kind of clipping from happening. And so there is now a really nice particle system here that's giving us this little bit of drift and dust and things like that. You want to be very conscientious with this in terms of using LODs, meaning that having one of these particle systems cover your entire level, probably not a good idea. This might actually make a little bit more sense if you wanted to have it constantly around. Having it on the player so that when the player spawns, right, the particles are kind of in and around your player. And actually, this would make even more sense if it was closer to the camera than less to the player. But then attaching this particle system to the player so that as they move, the particle system stays where they are. So your player gets the impression that these particles are everywhere in the world, but they're actually just parented to the character here. And so there you have it. There is now your particle system, fairly simplistic here in its design, but hopefully enough to give you a little bit of an idea as to how the Cascade particle editor works. Once we get a little further into UE5, we are going to be taking a look at the Niagara particle system and showing you how that system works. And so until then, I hope this has been useful, and we'll catch you in the next video.